of Center for Pastoral Leadership. We exist to look for unmet needs pastors have and not try to reinvent the wheel, but deal with issues that maybe we can be resourceful and helpful. So this time we've come along with understanding through a lot of conversations that we've had that our times now especially have made stronger the need for talking about emotional intelligence and managing stress and so forth. And all of us live with it in one way or another. So our interest is believing that believing a conversation like this will be helpful to you. We hope it is. So here's what you can expect. The brochure that you received by email has already introduced our presenters. Our first presenter will be Dave Cummings, Dr. Dave Cummings, who teaches biology here at Point Loma Nazarene University. And his session will be about a total of 35 minutes. And then there'll be a responding person, Christine Hung, who will introduce herself for maybe 5 minutes. And then following that, Dr. Chris Adams, who is professor at Azusa Pacific University, will take the same amount of time, and then he will introduce a responder, Derek Taylor, who will take about 5 minutes. And then we expect our time to be finished at about 11:30. If there are those of you who want to stick around after 11:30, we will keep open the meeting, but we understand there'll be some who have other plans because of how we scheduled and announced our schedule to you. So that is just for you to have some heads up about how to look at this and understand that the Resilient Church is the reason as the title of this event, because we all understand that we've been through a long slog with the pandemic and all that the infected's had, along with normal kinds of issues that put burdens on our life. So with all of that, we're going to go with our first presenter, Dr. David Cummings.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, John. It's so nice to see everybody. I really look forward to the day when we can be doing things like this back in person again. There's something strange about Zoom, isn't there? I don't pastor a church, but I teach students. And so I'm trying to have relationships and connect with people virtually in the same ways that many of you are attempting to do right now. And I know many of the struggles that come along with that. For the next half hour or so, what I'd like you to do is kind of think of me. Let me represent to you someone in your congregation. Think of me as someone that is in your flock that you're shepherding. And I'm hoping to enlighten you and inspire you a little bit in terms of giving you some insight into the mental health issues that many of us are struggling with. If you watched the invitation video that we prepared and sent out, you heard a little bit of my story, but I think it bears repeating at least some of the important details. Like I said, I'm not a pastor, I'm a college professor. Similar to the kinds of work that many of you do, it's very demanding, and it's the kind of work that never really ends. So it's incumbent upon us to set those boundaries, and I'm not always good at setting boundaries. I tend to be a bit of a yes man and take on more than I should for a variety of reasons. But several years ago, a little over 6 years ago now, I just hit a wall. I really burnt out, and I didn't recognize that it was burnout at the time. I just started getting sick physically. Your brain, I'm a biologist, so I think a lot about how our mental processes impact the rest of our body and vice versa. And our brain really can manufacture physical symptoms in the body. It's not all in your head or in your imagination. They're very real, and they often start in the gut. If you've ever had butterflies before, maybe a really big talk, I mean, all of you are public speakers, so you're probably beyond that. But if you've ever been nervous about something, you've had those butterflies in your stomach, that's kind of the ticklings, the beginnings of that fight or flight response that starts in our thinking and often first translates to the gut. And so I was experiencing some some GI discomfort. I'll leave it to your imagination to figure out what that all entails, right? But I wasn't feeling well initially in my digestive tract. And then over ensuing days, I started getting weaker and more fatigued. I started having dizzy spells. The fatigue got so significant that I got to a point where some days I couldn't get out of bed at all physically. I didn't have the strength to. My wife would have to help me to the shower or to the bathroom or maybe out to the couch. I just had no energy. I had no appetite. I was losing weight really, really fast. And so I was really kind of spiraling downhill. But the kicker was that I had so little self-awareness at the time that I didn't recognize just how stressed out I was. I didn't recognize that I had pushed myself to that breaking point. And so I went through what we would all do when we're feeling sick physically, biologically, right? You go to the doctor and the doctor sends you to different specialists, and every specialist was telling me just how healthy I was. And instead of that making me feel better, it made me feel a little worse. I'd get a little sicker because there was no diagnosis, there was no answer. And sometimes we just want an answer, even if it's not a good, happy answer. We want a path forward. We want some understanding. And I wasn't getting that. So this process of getting sicker and sicker, really not functioning well, interrupting my ability to work and function at church and at home, it continued. It went on for almost 2 months, which was just a lifetime because every hour feeling this way was really, really miserable. But I got to a point where one of the specialists, after visiting me and yet again declaring me perfectly healthy, right? I think he even said the word textbook in there, probably something like a textbook colon, or I don't know, something really personal like that. He followed that up by saying, look, you should know that I've seen these same symptoms in people dealing with chronic stress. My first thought was, are you kidding me? I've got my stress under control. And besides, I'm not imagining these things. I'm not making it up. And again, like I said, I hadn't made the connection yet, the biological connection that what goes on in our brains really can impact and create very real, not seemingly real, not imaginary, but very real physical ailments. For example, chronic anxiety or depression is tied in very closely with heart disease. We're not talking about a feeling of butterflies in your stomach or something you can imagine, actual coronary heart disease, right? So there is a very real connection there. And it took a couple months of me really struggling to finally come to terms with that possibility. And so I made an appointment with the psych department. They did an evaluation and very clearly and confidently gave me a diagnosis of anxiety and depression, largely, though maybe not entirely, due to chronic stress. And so that began the healing and recovery process. Now, there's not just one pill you can take. It's not like a broken bone or an infection that you can take an antibiotic to clear up. There's a lot more complexity to the human brain. And so it was going to take a lot longer to deal with that. But my process of moving forward included things like getting on medication, initially medication that could just calm the center of your brain called the amygdala that kind of sends out all those high alert messages. But after a couple of weeks of that, we were able to get on a much subtler medication that just kind of helps to stabilize the ups and downs and lets me think more clearly so that I could then go into therapy and begin working on, well, what are the actual life issues? Where am I stuck? Where are my hangups that I need to be working on? Where's my thinking not healthy? And what sorts of coping skills and resilience building strategies can I start building into my lifestyle? Now, there were a couple lessons. I'm a professor, right? And so I immediately have to go to the literature and start reading, start thinking about the science behind this. I need to understand the evidence behind this. I don't want to read just popular books because I don't know how well vetted they are. I need to really dig into the scientific literature. And honestly, one of the first lessons that I learned that was very helpful and very reassuring was that I'm not alone. And you've heard that phrase before, but when you experience a significant mental health crisis, it is very natural to feel very much alone and to feel like you are the only one who would understand and you're the only human being on planet Earth who has ever experienced this in this way. And while there may be some truth in that, we each experience our mental health struggles in different ways. reality is this is actually part of human life. So I'm going to share my screen with you just for a couple minutes. I want to show you some statistics that are on one hand disturbing, but on the other hand, very insightful if you're leading a group of human beings, like many of you are, and very insightful if you're personally struggling, actually very encouraging if you're personally struggling. So if you bear with me, I will share my screen here for a moment with you. And can everybody see a nice green screen there? Give me a thumbs up if you see a green screen there. Okay, good. So let's think about mental health by the numbers here. And again, I want you to think of me and some of these numbers in terms of your own congregation, in terms of the flock that you've been called to lead, because I want to give you some insight into what may be going on in the hearts and minds of these people. And I do want to tell you these numbers are very solid. They're very consistent across studies, and I've gotten them from very good resources like NAMI, CDC, and the National Institute of Mental Health. So these are not wishy-washy numbers or exaggerated numbers in any way. These are pretty legitimate, reliable numbers. So let's start with, if I can get this to work, there we go. The lifetime mental illness diagnosis rate. What does that mean? A lifetime rate means that at some point in someone's life, this will happen. So the idea that of all Americans, what's the likelihood that at some point in their lifetime they will actually be diagnosed, not just experienced, but diagnosed with some mental illness? And I'll tell you that's predominantly anxiety or depression or both. Have maybe a number in the back of your head of what you think that lifetime mental illness diagnosis rate is. And then tell me if this number actually comes anywhere close to what you were thinking. The number varies from one study to the next between 49 and 51%. So it's safe to say that half of us will at some point be diagnosed with a mental illness in our lifetime. So when you look out at your congregation, whether it's on Zoom or you're live together and you're seeing one another in church, understand that half of those human beings either have or at some point will be diagnosed with a mental illness, most often anxiety or depression. This is not at all an uncommon experience for human beings, including in the church. And I'll mention that again in a moment. Now, what about the annual mental illness rate? Annually means, okay, in any given year, what percentage of the population experiences, in this case, a diagnosable, but not necessarily diagnosed mental illness? And the overall number is 20%. Okay, that means 1 in 5. So you may be saying, oh, well, Dave, I've got a small congregation. This probably doesn't apply to us. If you have at least 5 people in your congregation, this applies to you in the way that you lead that group, right? If you have at least 5 people, then the statistics suggest that on average, one of them is going to experience a diagnosable mental illness in any given year, most often anxiety or depression. Now, what if we break that down a little bit by gender? Men, that number is a little bit lower, about 16.5%. With women, it's a little bit higher, just under 25%.
Hey, Dave, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Dave.
This session is being recorded and we'll make that available to you. We really apologize. Not quite sure what's happening there. So what we were talking about a minute ago was this annual mental illness rate, meaning what's the likelihood that someone is going to experience a mental illness in any given year? And they don't have to be diagnosed necessarily. So this is a diagnosable mental illness. So not just a bad day or feeling a little low or blue or maybe experiencing a legitimate grief, but actually experiencing depression or anxiety or one of the many others like obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, etc. And we said that the number that's really robust, as I said earlier, is right at about 1 in 5, about 20%. The percentage for men seems to be a little bit lower, and on average seems to be a little bit higher for women. And I would also want to point out to you that in the LGBTQ community, which I know many of you work with, the number is considerably higher. And the purpose of my talk is not to argue the finer points of these or try to understand necessarily why. It's to give you some insight into your congregation and into the people that you're serving and that you're caring for right now. And so very clearly, a large percentage of people in the United States are dealing with and struggling with mental illness. And so, as I said, as a struggler, I find these numbers to be very encouraging because I realize that I'm not alone. And feeling alone is one of the worst experiences when you're struggling with your health. If you're not personally struggling, so you can't relate to the not alone side of things, then tuck these numbers away in the back of your mind as a way of yet another way of understanding who's in your community that you're caring for. And then finally, I find it really helpful to break this down also by race and ethnicity. And they may not have, NAMI, CDC, and NIMH may not have broken this down in a way that you like, but get what you can from these numbers using the race ethnicity categories that they've set up. And again, this is the annual rate by race and ethnicity. And the highest category are people that self-identify as multiracial. And in these particular studies, they actually do not include Latino as one of the races in the multiracial. Latino goes in just the Latino category. So these are more often than not people who are both Black and white, more than other groups. But there are also some other multiracial groups. But that's it, 26.8%. So fully a quarter of all the people in your congregation that consider themselves multiracial are likely to experience a mental illness in any given year. A little bit lower, but still higher than average number for the American Indian and Native Alaskan population. The white Caucasian population right at that average of 20.4%. Hispanics and Latina population a little bit lower, surprisingly, or maybe not, I don't know, at 17%. Black closer to 16%, and then the Asian population less than 15% actually. So understanding your congregation at the finer demographic level can really, I think, improve your understanding of what people may be going through in that particular group. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now. And I said that I had two really important lessons that I had learned early on that really helped me set off on a good foot for recovery. And the first was this lesson that I wasn't alone. The second was the lesson, and this one came a little harder, that I didn't have to be ashamed of my struggles, okay? That I didn't have to be ashamed. That lesson came a little harder because automatically in our culture, there's a little embarrassment when you feel like you can't handle life, like you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And I hate to say it, but the culture is the same, if not even more scrutinizing in the church than outside of the church. And so those numbers that I've shared with you really do hold true both in the church as well as outside the church. So I found myself dealing with feelings of unworthiness and shame at times. And so rather than looking to the literature for answers there, as a Christ follower, I looked to scripture and I asked God in the Bible, tell me, Lord, is this a character flaw? Is this a flaw in my spiritual character? Is this due to sin in my life? And as much as I've said in the past to other people that our trials are not necessarily due to sin in our lives, I found myself reciting sins that I was still struggling with and wondering if this was God's response and wondering if he had finally had enough of me. Just to be perfectly honest with you, that was a place that I had reached. And as I dipped into scripture, I won't go through all the passages that I have because we lost a little time here a few minutes ago and I want to try to keep us on track. But as I dipped into scripture, there were a few that really spoke deeply to me about this topic of shame. One is Romans 8:1 that says, "There is therefore no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." And knowing that I'm a child of the Lord, that I'm a follower of Jesus, and knowing that I am promised to have no condemnation for what's going on in my life helped me to shed and reject some of those feelings of shame that I was dealing with. Possibly most importantly was John 16:11, I think is 16:33. I should have it in front of me. It's in John. And what the verse says, it's when Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart for I have overcome the world. We often focus on that second half because it's the victorious half. But the first half of that promise is still a promise, folks. It's not one of those promises of scripture that we like to brag about and say, woohoo, in this world we will have trouble, and put it on coffee mugs and, on t-shirts printed and all that kind of thing. But for someone who's deeply struggling, there's comfort in knowing that even Jesus himself taught us, in this world you will have trouble. And I think it's important, I think it's relevant that in the second half, he doesn't say, but take heart for you have overcome the world, does he? He says, take heart for I have overcome the world. And so when we live our lives in Christ, we have the promise and the hope that our lives, our fate, our eternity is hitched to the eternity of the King who has overcome the world. Even if for now we have to go through some trials and struggles, and we shouldn't be shocked by those fiery ordeals, as I think it's Paul says to us, right? So there's some comfort in Scripture that that really does speak to this shame issue. Can sin be part of the story? Absolutely. Can addiction and bad behavior? Absolutely. But it doesn't necessarily have to be. And even in those cases, shame is not a productive approach, is it? Right? If you raised kids, did you ever say something that was shaming to them, or you ought to be ashamed of yourself? There's no way you can respond to that and fix it. Guilt, on the other hand, says, okay, there's a problem. You are in fact guilty, but there are steps that you can take to reconcile yourself to God and to other people. Shame just says, you're broken, you suck, get over it. Sorry, I shouldn't say suck. This is a bunch of pastors here, right? But that's what shame says. Shame says you are fundamentally flawed and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's a real strong temptation to feel that way when you're struggling with these things. Okay, I've spoken enough for now. I'm going to take a quick break here. And what I want to do is I'm going to ask Heather to send you all into breakout rooms. Let's hope this technology works for us better than it did a second ago, right? She's going to send you into breakout rooms of just 2 or 3. And when you get there, I want you to introduce yourself, maybe tell them, what role you have and maybe where you're serving. And then I want you to answer this question or discuss this question together. Who in your congregation are you aware of? Who within your flock that you're shepherding are you aware of that has mental and emotional health struggles? And then what kind of message are they receiving from you, from your leadership, as well as from your congregation in terms of those mental health struggles? I'm only going to give you 6 or 7 minutes to have this brief conversation. So maybe only a couple minutes each if you could do that. And then Heather's going to bring you all back to the main room and I'll start to wrap things up with you on this first half of our conversation. Does that sound good? Okay, Heather, if you could go ahead and send people into their breakout rooms, that'd be great. In terms of how people received me and received the news that I'd been given a mental illness diagnosis, particularly at my church, but also here at PLNU, which is a very godly family that I'm a part of as well. And then maybe even a couple things that weren't so helpful. Just again, to give you insight from the perspective of someone struggling in these areas, who wants to be loved and accepted at his or her church and his or her family. First of all, a couple things that were not helpful, and this didn't happen very often, but every now and then someone might trivialize what I was dealing with. And I don't know if that happens out of a fear about the conversation, just don't want to go there, so let's just sort of trivialize it and move on, like, oh, no big deal, kind of thing. Or if they just don't know what to say, or if they actually believe that it's not a big deal. But people would often start those with statements that had the word just. So just cheer up, just get out of bed, just think happy thoughts, just stop worrying so much. Let me tell you that if your advice to someone about anything ever begins with the word just, you're probably oversimplifying their situation. And it's hurtful. It's very painful to hear that someone thinks you should be able to get over whatever it is you're dealing with just like that, right? So don't trivialize what someone else is going through. Don't give platitudes or offer oversimplified solutions. Don't minimize it or dismiss it as not a big deal, because if it's a big deal to me, that's what matters. My perception of whatever it is I'm struggling with is what matters, not your perception of what I'm struggling with. At the same time, some people sort of ignored or avoided me. Again, I think that's because they didn't know what to say. If you've ever seen someone sitting in the back pew crying, you're hoping somebody else goes and talks to them because you're just not sure what to say to that person. You know they need an arm around them and a kind word, but you're not sure if you can get drawn in, and not sure what you're going to say. I think for a while people ignored or avoided me, and maybe because they didn't know what to say necessarily. And in some rare cases, some people, I would say, over spiritualized my problems, where I even had people sending me emails saying, you need to stop seeing that non-Christian psychiatrist, or you need to stop taking your medication, and what you really need is to memorize these 6 verses. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe that a whole person needs a whole solution, which includes a spiritual aspect to these solutions. But when your brain chemistry is off, then getting a medical opinion and medical intervention is a valid thing, right? If I had, like I did once, crushed my finger by hitting it with a hammer, should I be praying? Yes. Should I be reciting verses that I've memorized? Sure. But I should be doing that in the back of the car on the way to the ER. Because as part of God's grace to us, he has given us these medical professionals that can intervene and can help. I'm not saying don't involve a spiritual aspect to this. And I'm not saying that spiritual illness and spiritual warfare even can't be part of the problem. But there were folks who said that was the only thing that was going on. Somehow, I think we mistake our brains for our souls. And let me tell you, I don't understand the matter, the physical matter of what our soul is, but I don't think it's made of the same stuff my brain is made of. I don't think it's made of neurons. I don't think it's made of neural connections and neural synapses. It's not made of proteins and carbohydrates and lipids and DNA, okay? And so let's not make that mistake, because that again is very hurtful and not helpful. What was the most helpful, the absolute most helpful to me, coming from my fellow parishioners, coming from leaders in my own church, was just a non-judgmental acceptance of my experience. They may not have been able to understand it or even relate to it. They may have had thoughts in their minds that, hey, this isn't as big of a deal as Dave's making it. He needs to pull himself up by his bootstraps, right? Suck it up, buttercup. But when people didn't say those things, but instead showed compassion, clothed themselves in the compassion that Jesus gives us and calls us to clothe ourselves in, and express that compassion to me, regardless of whether they understood it or could relate to it, or maybe secretly even blamed me for the situation, that empowered me to remain fully integrated into my church community and not want to withdraw and isolate. And it empowered me and encouraged me to continue to get the help that I needed. And the other thing that was really important was, rather than trying to fix me when they would point me to professionals, whether it was pastoral counselors who had experience dealing with anxiety and depression, or pointing me to my therapist at Kaiser when I needed it most, right? But launching me into the hands of the people that God has empowered to help me through what I was going through. So that just full acceptance, non-condemning, non-judgmental acceptance of my experience as valid and legitimate, and then nudging me into the hands of the caregivers. Those were the 2 of the most absolutely important things that got me on a track of recovery and healing, and have kept me on that track of recovery and healing. I'm going to finish now because I am out of time, but I thank you so much for your attention and listening. And we've got a great 45 minutes still ahead. Please don't log out and quit. We've just gotten started. Thank you, guys. Very nice to see you all.
I think I'm up. Is that right, John? So let me just introduce myself. My name is Christine Hung. I am in the NorCal district as the Director of Pastoral Development. And so one important aspect of my role is to continually assess the well-being of our pastors and their families. And my husband, Albert, who happens to be the district superintendent of NorCal, right from the beginning of our time here on this district, it was really important for us to express our ardent desire to bring out in the open conversations about mental health for our pastors, especially in light of the stories of suicide that we have heard, of pastors that seem to have it all together on the outset. So what we did, Albert and I, we worked really hard at every gathering that we had with pastors just to get rid of any negative stigma that comes with therapy or counseling, especially with some of our non-English uh, minority pastors, because the negative stigma is often tied to the cultural norms. And so to speak freely about our own experiences with therapy and counseling and how it has helped us, um, especially in light of what is going on in the world right now, pandemic, crisis, political tension, racial tension, all of these things. We have been noticing with our many of our pastors, anxiety and stress is at an all-time high. Something we have established on our district is a mental wellness clergy grant for pastors that would like these services, but they don't have the financial means. So it is a grant to just give them the means to find counseling services, and we have more people applying for that than we ever have. So we know that it is an issue. One aspect that I really wanted to touch on, and I'm not sure if everybody on this call is Nazarene. I'm going to assume that most of us are. And it is the negative stigma that we tend to have in our denomination, because we are a holiness denomination. We think that since we are perfectly sanctified, we should not be experiencing things like depression or anxiety, and that when our depression affects our relationship with God, there's that added shame that David was just talking about. And so a lot of pastors will not openly admit that they are depressed, that they need the mental support that they do. And not only that, they tend to give the same message to their people. And David talked a lot about this already, but Tangla Mental Health, it's an organization that kind of coined this. I don't know if they coined it, but it's this term toxic positivity. And it's this overgeneralization of a happy and optimistic state in whatever situation you find yourself. So it's invalidating genuine human emotional experiences, denying negative experiences, dismissing negative emotions, giving the message to others that they should feel ashamed of their negative emotions. And so they are given that message: pray harder, you just need to have more faith. And there's nothing more spiritually abusive or toxic to give that message to people that are going through depression or anxiety or high amounts of stress. Um, as much as if somebody was diagnosed with cancer. I think David mentioned hitting her thumb with a hammer, but let's ramp it up a little bit. I was diagnosed with cancer a couple years ago, and if somebody told me, forget the doctors, just pray harder, you just need more faith, that would be the worst thing to say. And it is actually the exact same thing when you say that to somebody going through depression or anxiety. As much as somebody with cancer should go to a doctor, somebody going through mental health issues need to go see a therapist. That's just the way it is. Um, as an encouragement for you pastors, a lot of our pastors that do apply for this mental health grant on our district, we encourage them to talk to their church boards and to take the steps to make it a matching grant. Most pastors do not want to do this. So whatever the climate may be at your church, the pastors don't feel comfortable in being open about that. And so what we try to encourage church boards to do is to set up in the budget uh, mental health um, access for pastors, so they don't have to go and get uh, approval from the board. They know that every year they have $1,000 or whatever, a couple $1,000, just to. We're not even talking about pastors that are going through deep depression. We're even talking about pastors that are going through mild stress that just needs to get a mental tune-up, so to speak, because it helps your resilience when you do face those stressful problems that come out in the future. Mental health now helps with pastors dealing with these potentially toxic environments in the future. So have your church board set up a mental health budget for you and your staff. Um, and I think just one last thing that I'd like to say, if you are dealing with pretty serious mental health issues right now, or you have a close loved one, sometimes being with that person can be taxing on your own mental health, and you're not in a position where you can help. And I think there's a lot of shame that goes with that too. I think you should just release that burden of having to be that person for your spouse or for your parent or your sibling or whatever it may be, and point them to other people that could help in the journey. Um, so there's this one, you might have seen it, there's an image that's floating around of someone with depression on the bottom of a pit. And sometimes it's not a person on the top of that hole, like putting a rope down to try to, bring you up. Sometimes that's not what's needed. Sometimes it's to have that person come down in the hole with them and just kind of uh, be there as Job's friends when they did it well and they did it right. It's just to sit in silence with people. So those are just some of the things that I wanted to share. Um, thank
Thank you so much, Christine. Am I up, John?
Yes, you are.
Okay, very good. And I want to say thank you to Christine for just all of your practical recommendations for districts and congregations, and hopefully we'll share some things that will reinforce that and echo that. And thank you to Dr. Cummings for your transparency and vulnerability, and for your heart for people, for the church, and for pastors in particular. It's an honor to be with you all. I am a pastor's kid of a pastor's kid in the Church of the Nazarene, and have a number of years in pastoral ministry experience, local church and university chaplaincy before becoming a psychologist specializing in working with clergy. And so I'd like to think with you a little bit on kind of two levels here that Dave has already articulated. One is, how are you thinking about pastoral care, particularly during COVID? And then how are you thinking about your own well-being and mental health, and what do we know can be helpful to pastors in particular? So I hope to share both of those. And then after I'm done, I will introduce Derek Taylor, who will, from Center for Pastoral Leadership, who will respond and share some thoughts. So I want to just mention to you that anxiety has now eclipsed depression as the #1 mental health issue in the United States, and depression is #2, and that's pre-COVID. And so that COVID has simply, exponentially upped the ante, if you will, for anxiety and depression for everybody. There's one caveat to that, excuse me, that I think is important for us to hear, which is psychiatrists have done some research during COVID, and it appears that about 10 to 15% of patients who were struggling with significant anxiety and depression pre-COVID have actually gotten significantly better. Now, this was a surprise. People were not anticipating this. So why might that be the case? Well, with anxiety, sometimes some kinds of anxiety have to do with anticipation of catastrophe. And so now that something catastrophic has happened, then it sort of validates that, and people can relax and are actually improving. With depression, which can be inherently isolating, now that everybody's sort of struggling with a little bit of depression at least, there's a validation in that, and sort of the misery loves company kind of thing in a way, has actually helped folks who were feeling kind of alone in their depression now that the whole world is battling this. And I think what we take from that then is just to reinforce what Dave and Christine were saying, that for people to know that it's okay to be in the struggle and that you're not alone, and that we don't want to shame people and spiritually abuse people when they're struggling with these things. I want to suggest to you that those of you that are local church pastors, you are frontline mental health workers. I don't know if you think of yourselves that way, but people come to pastors first, do they not? Because you're trusted, you're known, you're in relationship with people. And so certainly when psychotherapy is good, it's certainly a wonderful healing tool of the Lord. Medication is a wonderful gift of the Lord when it's needed. But people don't self-refer typically to a therapist or psychiatrist first. They come to you. And you probably aren't even aware of the extent to which you are doing preventative mental health care work just by simply showing up and doing your job well and having a congregation, Christian community that's worshiping together, doing life together. That's preventing an enormous amount of stuff. And there's no way to really measure that or quantify that, but we do know that that's the case. And so I want to share a couple of thoughts with you, and I'm going to try to share my screen here as well, about pastoral care of folks, and then about your self-care in particular as pastors. And can everybody see my screen? Good. Okay. So we know that that for any of us, for any person, well-being happens in an ecosystem. And so we can tend to think individualistically, depending on our cultural background. Some cultures are much better at thinking about community in the whole than others. But we really want to think about the well-being of the whole ecosystem, and also tapping into the resilience and resources within that ecosystem. It's not just the individual person, the parishioner, that you're concerned about, but they might be married, have a family, or have a immediate circle of concern of people they're close to, and then they're embedded in larger and larger circles of relationships, including the congregation. And so what pastors have a unique opportunity to do is you have a unique bird's eye view and capacity to influence that entire ecosystem, as well as individual people within that system. There is some research that suggests that although people come to you first for mental health difficulties or any kind of difficulties, the average American Christian can take up to 1 or 2 years even before they get up the nerve to come talk to their pastor about something they're struggling with. Not always the case. Some people will come right away. Some people come much more often than you wish, maybe, but people tend to take a while to get up the nerve to come talk to their pastor. And then they can take up to 2 or 3 years after those several conversations with you where you may suggest to them that, yes, we want to pray for you and here are some spiritual disciplines, but I think you should also talk with your physician or refer you to a therapist. Here are some people we trust here at the church that we know work well with the Christian people, Christian counselors. It can take up to 2 or 3 more years for people to follow through with that really good referral that you've made. So by the time they actually get into treatment, some people, many people, it's up to 5 years they've been struggling before they do that. And so it just underscores the importance of the preventative care that you're doing, the frontline mental health work that you're doing, and the encouragement. Sometimes pastors saying it's okay to see a counselor, it's okay to talk to a physician or a psychiatrist, can really help people give themselves permission to do that as well. I really like a book called Care of Souls by Benner, and he's a pastoral care and counseling writer, and I use his books frequently when I teach pastoral care and counseling to seminary students. And in one of his books, he talks about the continuum of pastoral care that is at work within most any congregation to some extent or another. So starting at the top there, the most basic level is Christian friendship. This is just the fellowship of of believers that are journeying together, doing life together, worshiping together, serving together, visiting each other in the hospital, celebrating when somebody has a baby or when somebody gets married, or they're there for one another when there's a funeral, all those kinds of things. And there certainly is a level of care, of pastoral care, that's the body of Christ building itself up in love. Amen. And you foster that. You uniquely have a way of orchestrating that and participating in that. And then all the duties that comprise pastoral work, pastoral ministry as a whole, sometimes we don't think about the ways that people experience pastoral care through those. So for example, Will Willimon, some of you may be familiar with his books. He has a wonderful book called Worship as Pastoral Care. Just by experiencing a worship service and the pastoral prayer that's a part of that, and worship through music and the arts and the sermon, there's a measure of care. Administering sacraments, people experience pastoral care through all of what you do, not just the individual conversations that you might have in your office with someone. And then again, it's not just you offering that pastoral care. And this is really the point I want to remind you of during this time, that it's all of the care offered by a Christian community. You have a unique role in that, as the orchestrator of that, as perhaps having more specialized training and experience in that. But want to encourage you to think broadly about the whole ecosystem of care. And then sometimes people need that more focused conversation. That's more of a spiritual direction kind of conversation. And if you're not familiar with spiritual direction, it simply is calling someone's attention to God's presence in their lives and what God is doing in their lives, and helping them to be aware of that and lean into that. And sometimes we need to spend some extra time with folks in pastoral counseling, where they're coming in to talk about a particular struggle of some kind that maybe involve spiritual dimensions and emotional dimensions. Benner talks about listening for the spiritual and the psychological struggles of people, and listening for the psychological struggles in the spiritual lives of people, and doing both of those, because we're really whole beings, and all that is intertwined and operates together. And so all of these levels of care are happening. And so a key question I would encourage you to ask yourself when someone's seeking care at the church is, what level is care needed? It may be one or more of these. And then do you as the pastor necessarily need to be the one to provide the care? Sometimes yes. Sometimes that makes the most sense. Sometimes having other folks do that, or making a referral to a professional, but still staying involved in a person's life. How's God using therapy in your life? How's God using medication in your life? Let's fold this particular emotional struggle of anxiety or depression or whatever it is into a larger view of your discipleship journey in some way. And I like to think in terms of a web of care. So besides realizing when you look at this that I'm not a graphic artist, I want to encourage you to think about this, because the temptation can be, we can feel the burden uniquely as pastors to care for people. And you do carry emotional and existential burdens for people, really unlike any other helping professional. And that's one of the joys, but also the challenges of ministry. And sometimes we can convince ourselves that it has to always be us, or only be us, to care for someone. And I want to help you think in terms of a web of care for people, that yes, meeting with you within the appropriate scope of practice of pastoral care and counseling is vitally important. But that alone may not be enough. But if they're meeting with you, they're maybe also meeting with a therapist or a physician. They're also getting support from family, and also in the choir. If you have a choir or a virtual choir right now, part of a Sunday school class, also part of a small group, and involved in the greater life of the church, all of that web together can do enormously healing things that you alone, just by one-on-one counseling with someone, could not fully accomplish. However, pastors are unique in the role that you have in orchestrating that web and kind of crafting that web in a personalized way around people. If you know that they need extra support, we can often set that web in motion and help it kind of be sustained over time. So I want to encourage you to think about that as you care for folks. And I want to pivot now to helping you think about yourselves. What do we know about the mental health of pastors? Well, not a ton, because denominations and Christian universities, seminaries often don't have huge amounts of money that it costs to do really sophisticated research, but we do know enough to know some things. So let me share that with you. The rate of clinical depression among pastors appears to be at least as high, but probably higher than the general population of the United States. So the numbers that Dr. Cummings shared with you earlier, clergy are right there, probably a bit higher than that. And I don't know if that's surprising to you. It's often not surprising to a room full of pastors who have been in ministry for some time. And I say that to just normalize depression in ministry for you. There are many, many reasons that contribute to that, but most any pastor, even the iconic pastor you think of that was formative in your own life, or the hero from church history or scripture, probably has endured at least one season of mild to moderate or more severe depression, largely induced by ministry work. And so I want to normalize that for you for two reasons. One is that we know the rate of depression for clergy spouses actually tends to be higher than that, than of clergy themselves, which tends to be higher than that of the general population. So there's something we think about the helplessness of the role of being a clergy spouse that maybe contributes to that. It's also a very isolating role socially at times. And so be sensitive to your spouses as well, because their unwritten job description is a challenging one, and you all know that. But we also know that pastors who are depressed severely tend to stay chronically depressed. Now, why might that be the case? Well, I think it's because of what Dave and Christine already articulated, and it's the reluctance to admit that to ourselves and reluctance to seek help. What I have heard so often from ministry leaders is something like what Dave shared. I'm probably the only pastor, or the first pastor you've ever seen who's this bad or who's feeling this way. When the truth is, if they only knew, and if you only knew how many pastors have been through a season where they struggle with depression or anxiety or burnout. But the other reason is I think pastors are reluctant to seek help because we can be very hard on ourselves. We have a sense of high calling, and rightly so. We want to do right by that calling, maybe even on some level justify to ourselves and to God that we're worthy of that calling or something. And so we can say to ourselves, I should not be feeling this way because I'm a pastor. I have a degree from Point Loma Nazarene University. I am ordained in the Church of the Nazarene. I've been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years. I should not be feeling this way. If I was good enough, I wouldn't be feeling this. And of course, being hard on ourselves, or even subtly, silently engaging in self-abuse even, and shaming ourselves internally only makes depression and anxiety worse, doesn't it? As opposed to doing what you do for everybody else in your life, probably, I'm guessing, which is extend compassion to yourself, be gentle with yourself. One of the questions I like to ask pastors to consider is what would you say to you if you came into you for pastoral care and counseling? We can often forget to put ourselves on that pastoral care list of folks we're concerned about and worried about, particularly during this pandemic, as you're constantly adapting to constantly changing county regulations about whether or not you can be open or closed for services, and you've got masks and no masks debates going on Facebook in your congregation, and you're preaching to a camera instead of to a live congregation at times, and all the adjustments that are having to happen right now. We can be unduly hard on ourselves, and Dave's absolutely right. There is no condemnation in Christ, including self-condemnation. And so want to just normalize depression for you in ministry and encourage you to surrender to Christ that invisible sack of shame that many pastors carry around. That's just induced by the complexity of the role. It probably is the most complex job description that exists, and I can back that up with research, which is sort of a setup to feel inadequate in general because none of us can be expert generalists. And so even pre-COVID, being a pastor is an incredibly joyful yet very complex, challenging enterprise, and even more so now. So I want to just normalize that for you, even in church history. You can read in Scripture, of course, and even in the writings of some of the folks we most value as heroes of the faith, Charles Spurgeon, Wesley, Calvin, Luther. Read the Psalms. There's straight up clinical depression in the Psalms, I would contend, that David experienced, and even Elijah, others we could name. I like this quote from Charles Spurgeon. If you're familiar at all with Charles Spurgeon, the holiness preacher from the 1800s. The strong are not always vigorous, the wise not always ready, brave not always courageous, and the joyous not always happy. There may be here and there men or people of iron to whom wear and tear work no perceptible detriment. But surely the rust frets even these, and as for ordinary people, the Lord knows and makes them to know that they are but dust. And you can read some of Charles Spurgeon's other quotes where he talks about experiencing the castings down and the exhaustion of ministry, and very vulnerable and honest kind of conversation you can read in Charles Spurgeon's writing. So we're also not the first ministry leaders in the history of the church to experience these things. We also know from research that daily well-being accumulates, both positively and or negatively. So if you have a great day and you have 2-3 great days in a row, then that tends to accumulate and promote well-being and a sense of flourishing. But the difficult days, the difficult experiences, the daily grind, as it were, also accumulates. And what we find with pastors in particular is that it accumulates in ways that are outside of our awareness. It's a very insidious thing, and part of that has to do with how devoted pastors are. This tends to be an all-in sort of deal, isn't it? It's not as if you just half-heartedly punch a clock from 9 to 5 and do your job and can kind of take it or leave it. That's not the way pastors approach their work and what they do. We're all in. And there's always another urgent thing to get to, isn't there? There just always is. There's always some other fire to put out. There's always some other thing to be working on. One of my college roommates who's a Nazarene pastor in Michigan was saying to me the other day, he feels like Sunday comes every 3 days, even though he knows it's 7 days apart. It just seems like it's every 3 days. And stuff can accumulate and we can be carrying around a bunch of unresolved loss, a bunch of unresolved stress, even anger right now at the way congregations and parishioners are behaving toward one another. I hear a lot of pastors talking about disappointment right now that the pandemic has exposed a lack of spiritual formation, maybe in all of us to some degree, but here I thought my congregational leaders were more mature than this, and I see the way they're behaving in this pandemic, and it's been revealing and disappointing. And what do you do with that? How do you process that? So there are lots of reasons for depression in pastors. I'll just name a few. Dave Eisel talked about this, that the physiological over-arousal and chronic stress is a big contributor to clergy depression. The stress response system with our amygdala that Dr. Cummings mentioned, it's meant to be short-lived. That we go into stress response mode, and then the threat or stress or challenge passes, and then we go back down to kind of baseline rest. The challenge with ministry is, when do you ever really come all the way back down to baseline rest unless we're intentional about doing so? Because there's always something else that's stirring things up. And ministry is a very adrenaline demanding profession, but we're often not aware of that as pastors. We're overtaxing our stress physiology, all of our stress hormones, without realizing that we're doing so. And if we do that long enough, then that takes a toll. One of the things that happens in that is it suppresses our brain's manufacturing of neurotransmitters like serotonin and others that are involved with anxiety and depression. And so it's that chronic physiological overarousal that can be challenging. You also are frontline mental health workers, as I said, so there's a frequent, can be a frequent vicarious and direct exposure to psychological trauma in different ways. And we're around loss a lot. Other people's loss, certainly. You're the first person people call when the marriage ends, when there's a tragic accident, when there's a death, when somebody's in ICU with COVID. And you are never very far away from loss. And in addition to that, there are a lot of ambiguous losses that pastors experience that are things like loss of ministry dreams, or loss, what about when people leave the church to go to the church that, you know, is opening faster than you are during the season, or what have you. Now, sometimes pastors will say, well, actually there's much rejoicing depending on who it is that's leaving. You know, you've been praying for years and finally you prayed and fasted and got them out of the church. But most of the time there are those kinds of losses. And if we're not aware of those and haven't named those, then that can build up. Feelings of inadequacy and frustration in meeting ministry goals are related to depression. That's true in general, but maybe even harder to know right now. And what impact am I having? Am I even being effective? And COVID has just changed so many things. It ups the ante with the frustration. A low congruence with career fit leads to higher depression. So for example, folks that really didn't have anyone to help them think through on the front end, what type of ministry role makes the most sense for you, given your strengths and vulnerabilities and education. And it may be a wonderful person and even a wonderful ministry context, but the fit really isn't a good fit. And that is going to be even more exposed and exacerbated during this time. Unrealistic expectations for ourselves. People have lots of expectations for pastors, don't they? Some of them are bizarre and silly and crazy, and who knows where they come from. But again and again and again, what pastors say to researchers is that's difficult to navigate, but probably the most difficult expectations to navigate are the ones I have for myself. And so I want to ask you, are you being fair to yourself? Are you giving yourself extra grace during this season? Are you being gentle with yourself, allowing yourself to just be tired? Everybody's more tired than they typically would be. Everybody's experiencing a bit of sleep disturbance and disruption to their routine, which has consequences to our brain physiology in and of itself. And so are you being fair to yourself? And then difficulty with setting boundaries, reluctance to admit the role strain. The problem is not that we don't love what we do. In fact, one of my favorite quotes is from a mentor and friend of mine, Dr. Archibald Hart. Some of you may know that name, and he's fond of saying, pastors don't get into difficulty because they forget they're pastors. They get into difficulty because they forget they're persons, which means we have limitations. And if we don't set those boundaries and pace ourselves and just be willing to admit to ourselves when we're overextended, then that can also contribute to depression. So I want to again normalize this for you and just mention one other thing that we're finding. First of all, I should mention the way depression looks, the way it manifests itself can also vary by culture. So for example, Asian American cultures can sometimes somaticize stress, meaning internalize it and convert it into physical symptoms of stress. Everybody can do that, but Asian American cultures can tend to do that more than others. For example, we could talk about those differences with African American cultures or Latinx cultures as well. So it can look differently depending on your cultural context. And it also can look a bit differently by gender. And of course, we have to be careful not to overgeneralize with gender stereotypes or racial stereotypes, of course. But generally speaking, the way we've traditionally diagnosed depression probably is more a female experience of depression. In other words, women, generally speaking, don't pigeonhole any particular person, but generally speaking, women tend to feel their depression. That is to say, be subjectively aware of feeling down, of feeling sad, of feeling depressed. Men, depending on how they're socialized, can receive messages like men are tough, boys don't cry, and can kind of internalize this message to cut ourselves off internally from our own emotional life. And so it's very possible for a guy to feel profoundly profoundly depressed, but actually not be very aware of it. But it's evident in behavior, anger issues, in extreme cases, domestic violence, addictive behavior, self-medicating the pain in some way, is more often how that looks in men. And underneath that is actually a depression that has been unaddressed. And again, Dave and Christine both touched on this. The best approach to this is holistic for you or for anybody in your church. Of course, we want to talk about where is God in all of this, and are there things you need to think about that you need Christ to continue to transform in your life, but also address, first of all, any medical issues. There are different kinds of medical conditions, and Dr. Cummings could tell a lot more about this than I can, but that mimic or even induce depression and anxiety symptoms. So things like thyroid issues, for example, particularly for women, serotonin and estrogen do kind of a chemical dance in the brain and body. And so there can be other issues that are more what's called an endogenous depression or anxiety, meaning it's more biologically generated and driven than psychologically. But even if it is psychologically driven, that physiology can take on a life of its own, that needs not only spiritual care and counseling, but also often medication to help regulate the brain chemistry that's involved, and lifestyle changes. So what we know from research is that a combination of counseling, medication, and lifestyle changes, including things like getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night, practicing relaxation exercises, exercising enough, work-life balance, those kinds of changes. The three of those things together, counseling, medication, and lifestyle changes, are over 5 times more effective than doing one without the other two. And our culture often wants to take the antidepressant, but not really deal with the underlying issues or make any lifestyle changes. And that's going to help a little bit, but it's not going to be all that's needed. And we find sometimes in Christian circles, people are reluctant to take medication, which, as Dave described, really just helps to reduce the intensity, so that people actually can benefit more from the counseling than they would be able to otherwise. So the symptoms are reduced enough to really get the most out of counseling while people are also making those lifestyle changes. Also want to talk to you about ministry burnout just briefly, and then I'll be done here in just a second. We're still figuring out in social science the overlap and how to differentiate between depression and burnout. There's some overlap here. Some people have defined burnout as depression at work. So that's one distinction, maybe, that burnout is related to what you experience connected to your job, to your ministry role, as opposed to depression that's more pervasive in all of life. And what previous research has indicated, for most people, burnout comes first, even in other helping professions, and then depression. What seems to be the case for pastors is depression comes first and then burnout. And we still don't quite know why that's the case yet. But again, it may be that it's this lack of awareness that can happen, where we're overfunctioning and not really aware of what's accumulating. And we've heard that in some of the research I'm a part of hundreds of times, over and over and over and over again. Pastors have said, I didn't see it coming. It blindsided me. It hit me out of nowhere. And that's my concern at this point in this pandemic, that initially there's sort of the crisis response mode, like back in March. And I heard from a number of pastors, this is my thing. This is my jam. I'm energized by this. Bring it on. I want to adapt and meet the challenge. And they're able to do that in really effective ways for 2, 3, 4, 5 months even. But somewhere around 6 to 7 months into this, and now we're at month like 9 or something, right? Cannot sustain that crisis response mode anymore. and start to hit a wall of exhaustion, hit a wall of how much longer is this going to go on. And writers are talking about we're kind of in the disillusionment phase of this whole thing globally, that we don't know how long it's going to go on, and are we going to be open, are we not going to be open, masks or no masks, what do we do? And the longer this goes on, the more pastors are having to figure out how to pace themselves, that this is more of a marathon than it is a sprint. And burnout can involve these kinds of things, just the physical, emotional, mental exhaustion. Still love what I do, still believe in it, but I just got nothing left in the tank. I've just put it all on the field and have nothing left. Which then can be related to just having a reduced sense of adaptability and competency. I'm not able to bounce back or just kind of go with the flow as easily, because we've already adapted 12 times since March. And now we're going to have to adapt again, depending on what the governor or the county decides or whatever it is. And we can just wonder then, am I even really as competent as I thought I was? Because this is such uncharted territory. And we can even feel despondent or cynical, which sounds like this. What's the point? What good is this? I'm knocking myself out here 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week and not even sure if it even matters. Find ourselves starting to look through the job posting websites and fantasize about what would I do if I wasn't in pastoral ministry. Those kinds of things. Now that happens every now and then for every pastor under normal circumstances. But if these kinds of things are becoming dominant for you and frequent and intense, then that's something to pay attention to. We know that about a third of pastors are in moderate to severe burnout at any given time. About a third. But again, many of them would say, I didn't see it coming. So what's happening is we're moving through the mild and moderate phases of burnout without being aware that we're doing that until it hits a threshold of severity, and then we're really aware of it all of a sudden, when the truth is it has been building for quite some time. So that begs a couple of questions. Who in our lives knows us well enough and loves us enough to point out what those early warning signs look like in us specifically? So that we can be aware of it and start to take action early, so that it doesn't progress beyond a point that becomes then really costly. And then what kinds of things can we do to prevent it? So I want to suggest a couple of resilience practices here to you and remind you that the Christian church is the most resilient movement in history, in my opinion, having survived and even thrived during wars, famines, persecution, and previous global pandemics. And so we can tap into the resilience of our own faith and the resilience of your own congregation. What strengths does your congregation have? What strengths do you have? What have you tapped into in the past that has helped your congregation and you individually? I was a part of a panel a couple weeks ago with some folks that were national denominational leaders, and one of the panelists was African American, and he said, yeah, this is a very difficult time, and the African American community has been particularly hit hard due to healthcare disparities and so forth by COVID. So I don't want to minimize what we're going through, but he said, frankly, I'm a part of a group of people who's been through worse in history. And so I'm a part of a group of people who figured out something about grit and perseverance and are able to tap into that in a time like this. And so I want to encourage you to think about what has helped your congregation get through difficult times before. What has helped you get through difficult times before, and reaccess those things. Make sure to pause, step back, and check in with yourself. A couple times a day, what am I feeling emotionally? Where am I holding that in my body? Where do you hold stress in your body? How am I feeling physically? How am I feeling relationally, vocationally, spiritually? What's accumulating as I keep my head down and try to meet the challenges and respond and meet the demands? What's been building up that I need to pay attention to and process in some constructive way? Learn to recognize the anxiety triggers in your own life. If you have a history of trauma, for example, in childhood or adolescence or even in adult life, a crisis like this that is so pervasive certainly can trigger a trauma history of some kind. Some of us had very difficult family of origin experiences, and maybe we're verbally, emotionally abusive families. And so the kind of conflict that's coming at pastors right now in this politically polarized environment that we're in can be a reminder of some difficult things in your family of origin, and the way your family avoided conflict may be your first knee-jerk reaction. And so we need to cultivate that self-awareness that Dave was talking about and invite God into those fears. Okay, a couple more here. We talked about this before. We need to practice lament the way Scripture models for us. Scripture encourages us to grieve, actually, and that's kind of the hard word from the Lord. However, not to grieve as those without hope, right? So we need to name the losses for ourselves and help other people articulate those, and then find creative ways to help ourselves and others process this. This is what you do all the time for other people as you walk them through funerals and other ways of coping with losses of different kinds. And so you know how to do this, but sometimes we forget to do it for ourselves. Proactively reach out for support, because it's an isolating role under normal circumstances, much less when we're quarantined. Reach out for support from those people where you can just be a person. Your family, close personal friends, perhaps outside of your congregational context where you can just fully be yourself. Having a community of practice, other clergy to get together with, like we're doing today. In fact, you sharing with one another is probably more important than anything I will say or you'll hear today. And then reaching out for a leadership coach or a counselor, even in a proactive, preventative way, as Christine was talking about, can be so important. And find creative ways to process your feelings. What do you do with the anger you have at the way people in your church are behaving toward one another right now, or toward you? What do you do with the frustration of constantly having to have plan A, B, C, D, and E for Sunday, and we don't know which plan we're going to need until Saturday night, perhaps, and that gets frustrating and exhausting. What do you do with all of that? And learning to practice mindfulness practices from a Christian perspective, meditation, contemplative spiritual practices. Some people, it helps them to be engaged in some sort of art in some way, or music can be really therapeutic for people. So engaging in those kinds of things can be really important. And I just want to leave you with an image before I turn it over to Derek here. Had the opportunity many years ago to go to Italy, been there one time with a friend of mine who's a Nazarene pastor, and we went to the catacombs outside of the city limits of Rome. And if you're familiar with the catacombs, this is where early Christians buried their loved ones, many of whom had been martyred for their faith by the Roman Empire. Romans cremated everybody because it was more efficient, but Christians believed so much in whole person salvation and whole person resurrection, they wanted to save the remains of their loved ones. So they dug tunnels underground. This particular catacomb was 9 levels deep underground, over 1 million Christians buried in this single catacomb, and there are many others. And you can see built into the architecture here, as you look down this hallway, you can see archways built over the graves of men, women, and children, archways built over the top of the hallway. And we had a very passionate Christian tour guide who was just really preaching the gospel as we went through the catacombs. And she said, that's intentional architecture on the part of the early Christians. The arch was a Roman symbol for victory. You can see these all over Rome. Even next to the Colosseum is the Arch of Titus, built around 70 AD when Jerusalem was conquered by the Romans. And the Christians took that Roman symbol of victory and built it into the architecture of essentially their graveyard, where they would have worship services because of persecution, as a symbol and a reminder to them that Jesus Christ has accomplished victory over death, hell, and the grave, and any power. He's the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. And so I know you know this, but want to remind you that no matter what happens in the election in the United States, no matter how long this pandemic lasts or what happens, there is an arch of victory over your life, over your family, over your congregation, over the Church of the Nazarene, over the Church Universal, and we can rest in that hope as we think about the resilient church. And thank you so much for listening. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Derek Taylor. Derek is on the staff of Center for Pastoral Leadership. And I'm going to go ahead and put a plug in for this, Derek. Derek has some wonderful resources for you, including coaching groups for Nazarene pastors. And so I really want to encourage you to check that out if you're not aware of that. And maybe, Derek, you can say a little more about that if you want to. But I'll put a plug in for you. And I went a few minutes long. I apologize, but take it away.
Wow, thank you, Chris. My paper is just so full of notes. I'm going to try and make sense of it right now. It was super helpful, and I know I'm echoing as I watch the chat, echoing a lot of what's felt right now. There's so much to process here, and honestly, I can't think of a better message that we need right now. And so I just want to thank you for your faithfulness to ensure that we have this in front of us and help us process. So there's a few things that came to mind as you were sharing, and stuff that I'm sitting in. And as you mentioned, like I have the opportunity to sit with various groups of pastors throughout the week, just in learning communities. So my hope is that in processing these things out loud, that maybe it brings voice to some of how you're processing some of these things. Maybe not, at least maybe give you a place to go to learn about it more. But one of the things that came to mind was, you know, as we've heard both from Dr. Cummings and Dr. Adams, and about the shame attached to having these conversations, and even thinking about our own lives. You know, I'm reminded of psychologist Chris Ageris's work. It talks about defensive routines. And just what's really top of mind for me is, you know, this concept of defensive routine suggests that there are like patterned ways that we've learned from early ages of childhood that keep us from avoiding the pain of learning. And so when we think about, like, if you're not already, like, kind of leaning into and instead of being defensive, being more curious about how maybe some of these things might speak to our worlds and the various groups that we participate in, and the stress and the anxiety that we're encountering. It's a call to, like, consider, like, how are the ways that I might, even now as I'm hearing this, avoiding the pain that might come with just taking a closer inner look, right? So that was something that came up for me, was thinking about the sophisticated ways sometimes that we can avoid applying this on a personal level. One of them being just using it as a tool that I might use to help others. And so I was reminded as multiple times, Chris, as you were sharing, like just how, if we're interested in calling people to do the deep work associated with this, just how important it is for us to do the deep work ourselves. And that we can't really begin to do that with any sense of authenticity without first asking some of these hard questions of ourselves. And right, easier said than done, right? Because we do have a shame culture, unintentionally, I think, attached to talking about these things out loud. And so I found myself writing the question, like, okay, how can I contribute to a culture that makes it okay to talk about these things out in the open? Or what does it look like for me to reach out to somebody who God's laid on my heart that might be struggling, but for whatever reason, power dynamics or whatever, I don't reach out to them. And so Christine, you spoke about a number of those things that made that helpful. So the second big thing I think I'm sitting with, though, that's kind of connected with that, and I think is just showing up in a lot of research. And Chris, you really hit on this hard, that we really need each other. And let me just boundary that to specifically, I mean, in a lot of ways, we need people in other roles, but this group needs each other. Like the role of peer-to-peer clergy support, as important as it is, and then pastor story after pastor story where I listen to stress or anxiety that they went through, or a big challenge, and how important a clergy group support was in helping them navigate that challenge. I've heard that story in so many ways, and yet it seems like we're really behind the ball when it comes to creating structures that really make that an easy thing to walk into and step into. And so I'll just share personally, like my first pastoral assignment, I had some pretty big earth-shaking stress things that happened in my life. I'll leave it at that. And the journey, I found myself meeting with a professional therapist for a number of individual sessions, but what eventually materialized was me meeting with a group of clergy under the direction of that professional therapist on a weekly basis, just to talk about the challenges that I was going through, the things that might be stressing me out, and helping me get those things out in a healthy way that might have come out in an unhealthy way somewhere else. And I ended up continuing to meet with that group for 4 years on a weekly basis. And it was the most life-giving thing for me. And what's nice now is that a lot of professional therapists are moving to include the virtual space. And so even if one may not, a therapist or a group like this isn't located in your area, like it's a little bit more accessible now. But it was so important for me because it was there, just to touch on a few flag words that you hit, Chris, like that I got to explore, like how congruent was my life? Like how authentic did I feel like I could be in the role that I was being called to serve in? And how did I navigate bringing those things back into congruence? But also like the perspectives of others to help me kind of get on the balcony of my own life and kind of see the ways that other experiences or stressors or even celebrations or new developments in my life might be affecting my response or how I'm handling my own personal rhythms and development, but also just the relationships that were so dear to me, like that were just not even on my radar as to how those things could have been connected, like the role of a peer group in doing that. So I've already exhausted my 5-minute timeline, but I just want to again express my extreme gratitude, Chris, for what you're putting in front of us and the ways that you're directing us. And just a reminder out there that we really do need each other. And unfortunately, it requires a little bit more personal initiative from us to find those groups because the structures aren't set up for us to be able to be vulnerable, groups that we don't lead, that we can just kind of be human in. So thank you, Chris. And that's my time.
Thank you. Thank you, Derek and Chris, of course. Okay, we have a contract with you to be finished. And so if you need to go, feel free. We're going to hang on for those who can't for Q&A. And let me talk. I sent a chat out. Maybe you didn't see it. But Dr. Cummings, David Cummings, has a new book really that describes this experience that he expressed to you. And I hope that you look for it on Amazon. It's called We've All Got Bears, I think. You can look in the chat for right now and find it. So thank you all for being with us. We very much appreciate it and feel like our ability to follow up with this depends on your interest and needs, but we're willing to continue following up. You'll be getting an email today from Heather about what needs you might have and how we might go forward in the future as you wish us to. So you can look for that, and we stand ready to stay involved with you as you call it out. And so there, if you have to say goodbye, that's fine. We understand. We appreciate it so much. But otherwise, we're going to hang on for a little while. And I think, I don't know, the best way to do questions could be chat, but we could just, I don't want to all step on each other on talking at the same time. Dave Cummings, you've been in this a long time. Do you suggest a good way to have a Q&A?
Yeah, when there's a larger group that doesn't all fit on a screen like this, I insist that people stay muted and physically raise their hand. And then, John, you could actually call on people to ask their questions. So you would just need to be scrolling through the 2 pages of images of people so you can make sure you get everybody. That seems to work best in a large classroom.
Oh, that's fine. Okay. So we will, I've got down, I've got two screens to look at. So if I'm not watching you right away, hang in there. So anybody on screen number one for me, you don't know what my screen number one is, but anyway, we got a question anywhere, any response? Okay, Nathan Oates, I see you. Go ahead. Open up. There you go. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Calhoun. I would love to get resources from any of you that would help us to lead our congregation through a time of lament. We're thinking about following up the Advent Christmas season with a time of lamenting. Many people have died over the last 9 months, disappointments, changed plans, fractured wedding or marriages and canceled weddings. So my email is nathan@emmauscommunity.org, like the Emmaus Road, emmauscommunity.org. Would be super thankful for any resources anybody has on lament. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I think you'll find that some of Christine Hung's work has related to that with the Now movement that she's in part of, and lament is one of the major issues. So the two of you, not to exclude anyone else, but I know that she has particular focus on that from some of the activities she's had. Am I correct, Christine?
Yes, we had Dr. Sung Chun Ra, who wrote the book Prophetic Lament, come in and speak on a webinar. And so that's a great book study to do. I've got a couple of other resources I can throw up.
Okay. And by the way, if you're not on camera, I can't see your hand. And so if you know, I can't guess that far. Okay, another question. Anybody comment? Okay, I see Galen Sims. Have to turn your mute off button. There you go, Galen.
This is actually my husband, Bob Sims.
Oh, hi, Bob.
How you doing, Dr.
Good.
John? Good to see you.
Thank you.
This has been a poignant aha moment for me. About how long ago was my heart attack and stroke?
In 2016.
In 2016, I had a heart attack and stroke, and I lost some cognition, and I've still been working in the church. But it's been really a low spot for me. My wife has helped me through it, and God has helped me through it. By the way, Christine, we were praying for you about your cancer, and we love you guys. It's been an aha moment because I was really feeling shame personally. I didn't realize I was, but that's that I couldn't do the job I used to do, and that I was letting God down and letting my people down and all that goes along with that. And I just want to share, this is real. This is real stuff. I'm coming out the other end, but this has really taught me something today. And I really want to say how much I appreciate it. It's helped me personally.
Okay, thanks so much. All right, okay, I've got more than one. I see Travis Marshall, and the others, I'll get back to you, please.
Well, I just want to say thank you. It's very encouraging to hear this conversation happening in the Church of the Nazarene. My dissertation was on shame, and particularly pastoral shame lifting. And many other denominations have been engaging with this for some time. And my own tradition here, the Church of the Nazarene, has been pretty quiet on it. So I'm especially encouraged with that. Two things: empathy and culture. I'd love to hear maybe some of our presenters pick one or the other, especially within the clergy part of anxiety and depression, and maybe how that is in tension then with shame. So maybe culture or empathy. That's a wide open thing, but I'd like to, what pops into your minds maybe for a bite-sized bit?
Chris, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll take a quick stab at it. And I'm not sure if this is quite what you're asking. And by the way, I'd love to read your dissertation, so send that to me if you can. Some cultures, of course, are more shame-based than others, and maybe some religious subcultures are more shame-based than others. I feel like having grown up third generation Nazarene, we can be pretty good at shame in the Church of the Nazarene, and even be proud of being good at that, maybe a little bit too much. Is there such a thing as healthy shame? I'm not sure. I tend to think no. I don't think really shame is from God, and God wants to set people free from shame. But that can be more challenging for some cultures rather than others, and individual people can tend to be more prone to shame for a variety of reasons than others. Thinking about empathy, well, both shame and empathy, what I was thinking about, Dave and I were talking about, what all the things we'd love to cover, in a webinar, and emotional intelligence competencies, emotional and social intelligence competencies, which start with self-awareness, but then also involve other awareness. So self-awareness and empathy are the bedrock of emotional intelligence, which I think are the key competencies for pastors. Certainly we need exegetical skills, theological expertise, leadership skills, management skills, all of that. But you can have all of that and not have emotional intelligence, and ultimately that's not going to go well one way or another. So the self-awareness and empathy then lead to the capacity for self-regulation and being able to interact with people, interpersonal kind of skills in a really effective way. So those are a couple of things come to mind. Dave, you may want to take that a different direction or add to that.
I would just add a couple of things. Chris, you said some of the key points that I was thinking of as well. That empathy really does capture quite a bit of the teachings of Jesus. When he tells us to clothe ourselves with compassion, that requires empathy. When he tells us to be slow to speak and quick to listen, that requires empathy. And empathy, as Chris said, requires first, and I think this is really important, self-awareness. That it's very, very difficult to be effectively others aware, to be able to intuit the thoughts and feelings and experience of someone else when you're out of touch with your own thoughts and feelings and experience. And while working on yourself and your own self-awareness almost sounds like a selfish thing, it's an absolutely essential foundation to doing the relational work of ministry. I think of the passage in scripture I was reading last night, and I can't remember the address, forgive me, where the writer says, I can speak all these tongues and have, the voice of an angel essentially, but if I don't have love, then it's just a bunch of noise. And we can teach, we can preach, we can know scripture really well, we can biblically discipline people, we can share the gospel, and if it's done without any personal human connection, it's going to be really devoid of its power and persuasion. So those are just a couple of thoughts on empathy. And the other piece I would throw in there is that often when we think of empathy and or compassion that are really so closely related, we sometimes forget that it also includes showing compassion with people that are in a situation that we don't understand or that we even blame them for. Sometimes when we don't get it, we have a hard time empathizing or being compassionate. Or when we see very clearly that poor choices got them in that position, we find it very difficult to empathize or be compassionate towards them. And I believe that a biblical understanding of empathy and compassion compels us to express those qualities, that type of love, regardless of what we think of the position they're in, regardless of our own opinion of the struggle that they're in. So I would just add that to what Chris had to say, but wonderful question. Thank you.
Okay, I think I left a couple of hands raised that are still out there that haven't had a chance yet. Try me again. I'll look at page 1 for me. Anybody there? Nope. Page 2, any hands over there? Want to ask a question, make a comment? Okay, back to my first page. Anybody else? Okay, JJ, go ahead.
I just have a quick question that Dr. Adams, you might be able to speak to a little bit. I'm in Nevada, so I'm not quite at the point where we are back to shutdowns yet. But heading into the holidays, where we see depression and suicide rates already skyrocket during open times, I'm really wrestling in my spirit and my prayer life right now with how do I approach this in a new it just seems like another element. And I don't even know, like, it's such a new question for me because we're supposed to hear on Tuesday. I don't even know how to really voice it right now. The frustration and the heartache that I feel about the people that are going to be diving deeper into a depression they would already had. Is there anything that you can, I don't even know. It's not even really a question. I just it's something I'm struggling with right now.
Well, it's a great question and a very pastoral concern. It's certainly, you're absolutely right. Under any given normal year, depression and anxiety tend to go up during the holidays, partly due to busyness. But there's something about the difficulty of feeling down or grieving a loss when everybody else is celebrating or when I'm supposed to be celebrating. And that just seems to kind of make it worse. And if people are grieving the loss of a loved one, then particularly at those, at Christmas and Thanksgiving, when you would normally be with that person, that's particularly difficult. So I would say a couple of things. One is, holidays can get busier for pastors under normal years, but even now, so make all the more important to pace ourselves, but also think proactively from a pastoral care standpoint about who are the vulnerable people in our congregation and community that we need to proactively reach out to as we move into the holidays and provide ways of them feeling connected, getting support, those kinds of things, because you're absolutely right. Anybody that's vulnerable already, it's just going to get exacerbated by the holidays. And so, but we have to pace ourselves in that. So again, think about the web of care in that and get some help from other folks that, don't mind checking in on people and would even get joy from that, and those kinds of things. A couple of things that come to mind. I don't know if that quite answers your question, JJ. It's a great thing to think about.
No, it does. Thanks. That does help a little bit. Thanks. Again, I'm still processing it, so I don't even know how to ask.
Sure.
It's not fair for you to have to answer a question that's not really asked. So,
if I could add just a couple quick observations to that as well, because it's such an important topic. Part of my own burnout experience that I shared with you stemmed from not processing grief very well. My go-to was just simply to move through it as fast as possible because it was uncomfortable and painful, and to move on and to pretend everything was all fine. And what I've since learned is that I'll use a metaphor here because this helps me to envision it, but any sort of mental emotional struggle, including grief, maybe even especially grief, there are little gremlins inside our minds that have something to say. And if we do not give them voice, they will destroy us from the inside. And that's largely what happened to me. I had lost 2 brothers and a friend all in a short period. And I moved on through it as quickly as I could because it was just such an uncomfortable, scary place to be. And that definitely contributed to my breakdown. Since that time, some of you, if you pay attention to what's going on here at Point Loma, may have heard that we lost Dr. Ryan Botts here at the university. Ryan was actually my closest friend in the world besides my wife. And for the first time in my life, I grieved in a much healthier way. And it was fundamentally based on that principle that there were emotions in me, like little gremlins, that needed words, and I needed to give them words until they sort of had nothing left to say. And so it meant I had to keep revisiting that space of grieving until I felt like, okay, they've said their piece. And I can tell you honestly that even though I lost my best friend 2 months ago, I don't feel like there are any hurts or pains or emotions in me that I'm suppressing or that still have something that they really need to get out. The other piece to this, the other response I want to say is that for those of us that are in ministry of caregiving for individuals, there's always the risk that as we develop empathy and compassion, that we tip over into codependency, where we begin to take on the struggles of these other individuals as if they were our own. They begin to keep us up at night as if God expects us to find the solution for them rather than to do what he has called us to do in these relationships. And I would just say that that's part of self-awareness, is recognizing when we've tipped over from a healthy compassion and care into an unhealthy space where the problems and troubles and struggles and pain of other people are now breaking us down to the point of where we're not 100% and we don't have everything that we need to be able to give to all the other people that are depending on us as well. And so just being aware of that possibility of codependent decisions, codependent feelings, codependent words, and setting a soft boundary there that we can rein ourselves back in when we start to go into that place.
If I could add something to what JJ was talking about. So I'm doing some work with racial reconciliation, and one thing that we did, and Chris Adams, if you can just confirm that there aren't big risks in doing what I'm proposing. Something that we did is that we had a story circle. So this is power of being able to tell your own story. So we had a story circle with people of color that have experienced racism and the trauma of racism, using stories from the Bible as a launch pad. So just kind of reading passages and then asking provoking questions for people to share their stories. And there was so much, we've had our second session already. We're doing another one in a couple of weeks, but there was so much healing in that space. And so I wonder, JJ, if you can bring these people together, and you know, if you want, you can reach out to me and I can kind of show you the structure that we used for sharing stories. But it was a really powerful time. But Chris, I don't know, getting a bunch of people together that are going through this sort of depression and anxiety and telling each other stories, I don't know if that would, you know, cause more damage. I don't know. What's your take on that?
Sure. No, it's a great question. And and please let me encourage you, if you're not familiar with what Christine has been doing to learn more about that. There's some really incredible stuff happening that our world desperately needs, and our church desperately needs. I think, JJ, if I hear what you're saying correctly, you know, with all the loss, people are grieving people that have died from COVID or died during COVID and they couldn't really have a funeral maybe the way they normally would, or marriages have ended, or weddings that have had to be canceled. So there is something powerful in grief support groups, for sure. And so there are a number of resources I could point you to where people have thought through, you know, how do those work well. It's often best if there's an experienced facilitator. It doesn't have to be a therapist or a pastor necessarily, but somebody who can facilitate that conversation well and also recognize when somebody is in territory where they need clinical help and can, you know, nudge them that direction, you know, that sort of thing. But absolutely, I think the power of being able to share your story with other people is just inherently beneficial, and we're created for that, right? So certainly grief support groups could be really helpful.
Okay. Okay, Dr. Bob Zenger, please. You're mute. You still on? There, open your mic if you please. Thank you.
Yeah, Galen has a habit of muting me, but not muting me, but muting me. We've been involved in Grief Share for which we've sponsored it in several different churches. because we found such healing going on there. They're in 12,000 churches around all over the world. But we had lost this year. My mom and Gaileen's mom died within
5 hours and 15
5
minutes.
hours and 15 minutes of one another. And we were Gaileen's mom's caregivers for 3.5 years while we're doing everything else. But the worst loss is that after that, my niece that I taught school with, high school with, and we were on the same team and same students and everything, committed suicide just
2 months after.
2 months after that. And it took my head off, really. My mom and her mom were older, and we were prepared for that. But I was not prepared for my niece to commit suicide. So I thought I was prepared because we're the grief share teachers and moderators. And we've just been able to work through that. But it is a huge thing to face your grief. I just wanted to throw that out because part of all this is grief.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
And I might just respond to that quickly, John. There are some grief experts writing about the grief pandemic that's sort of trailing behind the actual pandemic. But to go through those significant losses in such rapid succession and then have the third one be a traumatic loss. And I suppose all death is traumatic in some way, but when it's, particularly when it's a suicide and when it's somebody who's young, then it becomes what we call complicated grief. It's more complicated to work through than sort of regular grief, if you will. And it takes time. What seems to be the case is after a major trauma like that, it's for most people 3 to 5 years till you find kind of a new normal. And that's not to discourage you, but rather to say, be patient with yourself in that. And I like to, some of you may know the name Harold Ivan Smith. I put a couple of his books in the chat. He's a dear Nazarene brother. He's a grief expert. And he likes to say to people to look at your thumb, because how you grieve is as unique as your fingerprint. Now, we'll all have things in common. You hear about the stages of grief. There are probably more dimensions of grief that most people experience just because we're human. So we do have that in common. However, we also, at least in some cultures, can tend to judge our grief process as if there's a wrong way to do it. And how you do it is how you do it. And that's okay. The only mistake you can make, if you want to call it that, is to completely avoid it, because that will have a boomerang effect of some kind. But I love the way, Dave, you put it, that you're able to visit your grief intentionally on a regular basis, because I don't know that we should also live there 24/7 either, nor can we, but to give yourself permission to do it uniquely and to visit it knowing that Christ is present and meets us in the midst of that. And particularly if it's, catastrophic loss or traumatic loss, sometimes we need the extra clinical help as well, just because we're human. It's just too much.
We have another question waiting, but Dr. Dave Cummings, I think you got another appointment. Do you have anything as you need to leave to say? Feel free.
There's nothing left that I have to say except thank you to all of
Okay.
you
Okay.
for making this a wonderful event. I am available for conversation anytime. You can reach me here at the university at my email or through my website, but I hope we can continue this conversation. It's wonderful to meet all of you virtually. Take care.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Zanger, please go ahead.
One of the things that as we talk about dealing with grief and the traumas of others is to remember that secondary trauma is a real thing, and to recognize the symptoms and when we start experiencing their symptoms, it's time for us to find somebody else to talk to deal with our symptoms. And I did my doctoral thesis on the influence of spirituality on resilience in the face of trauma. And one of the things I discovered is there is a long, long list of things that we can do that increase our resilience that are helpful. There are some things we can do that are detrimental to us, but for the most part, most anything we find that actually works for us, we need to do more of. And not to compare ourselves to what other people are doing, or try to meet other people's expectations for how we develop our resilience. Some of the things that has gone wrong is within the church is we tell people that if you do A, B, and C, it will resolve your problems. And the person does A, B, and C and it doesn't work for them. And now they're also mad at the church because we were unable to help them. Listen closely to your people, help them to find the things that actually work for them.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? All right. I think that's probably about good enough for now. Is one more call. Anyone else have a question, comment? Okay. Oh, Oni, go ahead, please. You need to turn your mic on. Oni, we can't hear you.
Yes.
There.
Thank you, doctor. I just want to ask anybody from the panelists or anybody from among us, because the current situation is that personally, I know this, that pastors are more busy right now than before because of this COVID. For instance, the provision of 3 services per week, the recording and the editing of the materials to be post live on Facebook and all those sorts. But one of the struggles that pastors are feeling is the feeling of or question that, is this worth it, or is this, am I making a difference on all of this? And that discourages us or pastors, because unlike before that we are seeing and people are reacting to what we're doing, today we don't have that because we are confined on one studio or speaking to the camera or microphone and doing that. So can anybody speak about a sort of a comfort so that in the middle of this so much busy life that we are doing, trying to pastor online, we hope to have some sort of probably a meaningful encouragement to that sort, something like that.
I would think Dr. Chris Adams might be in touch with this more than many of us, perhaps. I don't want to throw something at you, Chris, you're not ready for.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah.
I'll try. So that's a great question. Thank you. And I hear that a lot from pastors last number of months. One thing that research would suggest is that makes a difference is how we approach our philosophy of ministry to begin with. So we know that flourishing pastors, that not to minimize suffering or all the stuff going on right now, but that somehow are flourishing as much as anyone can during this season, approach ministry as participating with what God is already doing in the world. So it's just good old Wesleyan prevenient grace, the assumption that God is always at work all the time in everybody's life and in the congregation and the community and in you. And our role in ministry is to discern that and participate with that, which helps put the emphasis, if we can, more on the process of being in ministry with God versus outcomes and results and so forth, which is very difficult. I mean, we all want to know we're having an impact. I mean, you're knocking yourself out, working really hard. And so the other thing I've heard pastors say that's helpful is to actually solicit feedback. You get a lot of unsolicited feedback as a pastor, right? That isn't helpful and isn't even really accurate a lot of the time. But to solicit feedback from people you know that are supportive, but also will be honest in a way that is constructive, can be helpful. So, whoever that is, if you get several folks that are watching you preach online and can give you good feedback about how did that come across, that kind of thing. Some pastors also are, for however long we're in line, are engaging people during the sermon with like live polling, for example, or putting questions in the chat, or having Facebook Live, having people comment. that sort of thing. And so it's up to you how much you want to engage with that kind of thing, but that's another way to get some feedback. The other thing I've seen some churches do is do a couple of congregational surveys. Right now, just how you doing, or what are the needs, or how are our ministries going, those kinds of things. Not so much in a customer satisfaction way, because we don't want to encourage kind of that consumerism as much as what are the needs and are we meeting the needs type of thing. So that can be another way that's helpful that occurs to me. But it is challenging. So trusting God in your own faithfulness, and that God will take care of the fruitfulness in ways that you may even never know about until heaven. But that's not easy.
Good, thank you. Maybe someone else would like to add to that. That was wonderful. Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate that. God's always at work. It's not our work, it's his work. We're joining him. Anyone else on that? It's good. Okay, any other questions? All right, as I said earlier, we're going to send an email out with a response from you back to us on what we need to do to help going further, if you might wish to, and in what ways might we do that. So we open the door for future continuing with this if there is a need for it and a response from you. And also some of the information about the coaching groups and the books that we've talked about and resources, that will come out too. Heather will be sending that to you again today sometime. All right, I think we're going to wrap it up then. Thank you all for being with us. I feel like we all had some invested interest that was appreciated, and it's a wonderful thing. God bless you all. Thank you.